Hello, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Kate, and I have another catchy thesis title. My EP is a safety net, an exploration of the support educational psychologists can provide for emotional literacy support assistance working with children who have experienced domestic abuse. So, in terms of domestic abuse in the UK, it is sadly a really pervasive problem. So in the year up to March 2020, in the UK, 3.5% of people had experienced domestic abuse. And that's just the people that have reported it to the police. So we're looking, in reality, a much higher prevalence. Then March 2020, obviously a big year for lots of other reasons. There's not much data on the year gone by. However, the data there is, and what you've probably seen in the news, is that there has been what's termed a shadow pandemic. And that has been since people have been confined to their homes, and there's been lots of other social strains on people. Domestic abuse rates have risen. Now, within the local authority that I conducted my research, some internal reports have suggested that 1 in 20 people in this particular London borough have been victims of domestic abuse. And the MASH, the Safeguarding Hub, have suggested that 90% of those cases, they know that there have been children present in the home. Now, for us, that's obviously a really pertinent piece of information, particularly as exposure to domestic abuse. Lots of research has suggested that they're 4 times more likely to suffer from kind of social, emotional, and mental health difficulties as a result of that exposure. Now, how does that link to the ELSA programme? Well, if we're thinking kind of about the last 10 years within the UK, thinking kind of post-2010 coalition government and the start of austerity measures, which have meant huge funding cuts for a variety of services. So we're in a situation with rising rates of domestic abuse, rising rates of SEMH need among the pupil population, decreased funding for associated services, and there's been some suggestions by Women's Aid that services have been cut by 85% for domestic abuse services. And increased pressure on schools to provide, as of the Theresa May's Green Paper, SEMH provision, social, emotional, mental health provision in schools for children. We've got this kind of perfect storm of more problems, less money, which means that schools are having to be really creative in the ways that they support these children. And I'm focusing in on how the ELSA programme, which is used really widely across this particular borough, how that is used to support the children who have social and emotional issues related to domestic abuse. Because anecdotally, EPs in the service were saying, well, this is coming up in supervision all the time. But this isn't something that's been referenced in literature before. So my research questions. Essentially, I was looking in at what do EPs do to currently support ELSAs? What do the ELSAs and SENCOs do to support the children? And what are the barriers for using the ELSA programme? It's obviously non-specialised, quite general programme delivered by teaching assistants within schools to this group of children with a very particular set of needs and experiences. And the final research question was, what does all of that mean for EPs? Now, in terms of my design, I used a soft systems methodology approach, which I'm sure you'll all remember exactly what that is, but just in case, essentially it is picking a problem. So my problem was, how can EPs support ELSAs working with children who have experienced DA, domestic abuse? Sorry, get in that thesis mode of acronyms and forget that nobody else necessarily knows what they stand for. And I used that collaboratively with 4 EPs delivering the ELSA programme within this particular service. So that looked like 10 interviews with 4 EPs, 4 ELSAs in the borough, and 2 SENCOs supervising the programme, followed by a focus group of 4 EPs, where I shared with them my thematic analysis of those interviews, We co-constructed themes, and then we created a rich picture and did an analysis for what could be the next step forward for the service, so kind of an action plan. Usually step 7 of the process would be putting that plan into action. However, I've just done 1 to 6 and I'll just trust that they'll go on with stage 7. So in terms of my key findings, I've got 4 there, but I actually had 6 themes. Now, these 6 themes fitted into these 4 kind of overarching points, and that's what I went into in my discussion. And so for speed, I'm just going to talk about these 4 rather than unpicking the 6 themes. So ELSA-child relationship. Now, obviously I've come into this at an angle where I'm saying this isn't a perfect program, but what I don't want to do is to suggest that, you know, it can't be used at all with these children. Because actually there was seen that there were a lot of protective factors for these children and young people who most of the time wouldn't be having any other support from elsewhere. So ELSA's provided huge amounts of emotional containment for these children. ELSA was described repeatedly as a safe space, somewhere where they could have a trusted adult they could go to, and actually almost all of the ELSAs spoke about safeguarding disclosures within their ELSA sessions, which indicates that there really was this trusting rapport built up. But as a result of that, ELSAs themselves were in desperate need of emotional containment. So that's where the EPs come in. So as the professionals supervising the programme, they provided, and what was neatly described by the ELSAs as a safety net. Now that safety net comprised of a number of different factors. So I've already mentioned safeguarding. EPs have played a really important kind of practical and procedural role in supervision sessions and ad hoc contact in terms of ensuring that ELSAs were following proper safeguarding procedures, and also in terms of checking that the referrals themselves were appropriate. Because in kind of interviews and later discussions with the EPs, it seems that they were being used as an intermediary between the SENCOs, who were the line managers of the ELSAs, and the ELSAs themselves to suggest whether referrals were or were not appropriate. And in terms of domestic abuse, it would often be a case of it coming up in supervision and the EP going back to the SENCO and saying, actually, this needs a more specialised, more highly trained individual to be dealing with this particular case. Then they also supported, the EPs that is, application of psychological theory, so in forms of CPD, ad hoc CPD and supervision, in terms of email communications, in terms of general support, in terms of resources they provided. They're the ones that were constantly bridging theory to practice and reminding the ELSAs to bring things back. Oh goodness, 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through impact of austerity policies. I've spoken through that a little bit already. Essentially, resulting in overuse of the ELSA programme. When there's nothing else and schools are desperate to support pupils and to do the right thing, they're going to use what they've got. And using what they've got is often going to be imperfect and not ideal. And in terms of the ELSA programme, Burton, who sort of created it, is very clear about what referrals should be and how things should be applied, but I realise that that's very much not how it's being used in schools, particularly for these more vulnerable groups, as a result of the pressures that schools are under. So is ELSA the right intervention? Is it being utilised as it's intended? In a lot of instances, no, but with well-meaning reasons behind it. And are the least qualified teaching assistants with 6 days of training in social and emotional interventions are working with exceptionally vulnerable pupils? And it came up within these interviews that they're not just dealing with children who've dealt with domestic abuse. We're talking about dealing with children whose parents have addiction difficulties, where there is issues with homelessness, issues with bereavement, on top of domestic abuse, and often kind of interrelating factors. There's an awful lot for them to be holding with such a minimal amount of training. And the fact that whole school approaches, so whole school trauma-informed approaches, were not often being used, which was kind of an interesting finding in terms of where EPs could go next. So in terms of kind of the key points, which I've handily put in orange for you, So I feel that using the ELSA programme to support children affected by domestic abuse rests on the assumption that potentially limited intervention is preferable to no intervention in the context of limited resources. So I am not saying that it's not the right thing. I'm just saying we're assuming it's the best thing considering that there's nothing else. So kind of next steps for future research, I think that somebody needs to think about the efficacy of the ELSA programme in working with these children. And that kind of pragmatic question of whether the absence of more suitable provisions, the ELSA programme provides better than the alternative, which is nothing. And if it is this imperfect stopgap provision, is its use by schools problematic if it's perceived by stakeholders, so EPs, the local authority more broadly, to be a more effective intervention than it is? Is that stopping further things from being created and more support from being put in if we're saying, oh, we know that there's a high percentage of pupils affected by domestic abuse in that school, but they've got ELSA, or we'll ELSA it. And ELSA being perceived more broadly as this catch-all SEMH intervention for pupils, and particularly for vulnerable pupils. And are we in turn stopping more effective provision from being put in place by using this, it's better than nothing, let's ELSA it?